I thought the house was empty. Everyone did. For nearly 5 years, the old house sat alone at the edge of town, hidden behind dead trees and overgrown weeds. Nobody ever saw lights inside. Nobody ever saw a car in the driveway. And nobody could remember the last time anyone had entered the property. The house became one of those local mysteries people talked about, but never investigated. Some people claimed the owner had died years ago. Others believed the family simply packed up one night and disappeared without warning. No matter which version of the story you believed, everyone agreed on one thing. The house was abandoned. At least, that's what I thought. One cold October evening, my friend Ethan and I decided to see it for ourselves. Looking back now, I wish we had stayed home. The sun was already beginning to set when we arrived. The property looked even worse up close. The front porch had partially collapsed. Most of the windows were covered in dirt. The paint had peeled away from nearly every wall. Yet something felt strange. For a house abandoned for years, it looked too intact. There were no signs of vandalism, no graffiti, no broken bottles, no evidence that curious teenagers had ever explored it before. It was almost as if people intentionally avoided the place. Ethan noticed it too. Neither of us mentioned it. Instead, we climbed the porch steps and tried the front door. Locked. We checked the back entrance. Locked. For a moment, I thought that would be the end of it. Then Ethan pointed toward a basement window. The glass was cracked, just enough for someone to squeeze through. A few minutes later, we were inside. The air immediately felt different. Heavy. Still. The smell of dust filled every room. Our flashlights swept across old furniture covered in white sheets. Family photographs still hung on the walls. Books remained neatly arranged on shelves. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused, as if someone had simply walked away and never returned. We slowly searched room after room. The kitchen, the living room, the dining area. Everything remained untouched. Then we found something that made us stop. A mug sitting on the kitchen table. At first, it seemed ordinary, until I looked inside. There was liquid in it, not much, but enough to make my stomach tighten. Ethan laughed and said it was probably years old. I wanted to believe him, but something felt wrong. People don't leave half-finished drinks sitting untouched for 5 years. We continued upstairs. The second floor was even stranger. Several bedrooms remained fully furnished. Clothes still hung inside closets. Beds remained neatly made. One room contained dozens of family photographs. Most were faded, but one looked surprisingly recent. A family standing in front of the house, smiling. Normal. The date written on the back made my heart skip. It wasn't 5 years old. It wasn't even 1 year old. It had been taken only a few months earlier. I stared at the date for several seconds, then showed Ethan. Neither of us spoke. For the first time, we both started wondering the same thing. What if the house wasn't abandoned? Before reaching the end of the hallway, we found another room. At first glance, it looked completely ordinary. A small bedroom, a desk, a bookshelf. Nothing unusual. Then Ethan opened one of the drawers. Inside were dozens of handwritten notes. Most of them contained random observations, dates, weather conditions, descriptions of ordinary events happening around town. It looked almost like a journal, but the entries became stranger the more we read. One note described a delivery truck stopping outside the property. Another described a family walking their dog down the road. Another mentioned teenagers standing near the fence. Every entry included exact times, exact descriptions, as if someone inside the house had been watching the neighborhood for years. The final entry made my stomach tighten. It had been written only 3 days earlier. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. It simply said, "They came onto the property again today." I stared at the date, then checked it again. 3 days earlier. Not months. Not years. 3 days. Someone had written that note recently. Someone had been sitting in this room, watching the road, watching the neighborhood, watching everyone. Ethan quietly placed the notebook back into the drawer. Neither of us laughed anymore. Neither of us wanted to keep exploring. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and by then we had already gone too far. The feeling only got worse when we reached the end of the hallway. There was a door. Unlike every other door in the house, this one looked newer. The wood wasn't damaged. The handle wasn't rusted. And most importantly, it was locked. We tried turning the handle. Nothing. We pushed against it. Nothing. The room was completely sealed. Ethan joked that maybe someone was hiding treasure inside. I laughed, but neither of us found it funny. Then we heard it. A sound, very faint, coming from behind the door. 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Both of us froze. The hallway suddenly felt ice cold. We stared at each other. Neither of us moved. Several seconds passed. Silence. Then the knocking came again. This time louder. Knock, knock, knock. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. There was somebody inside. There had to be. I stepped backward. Ethan did the same. Then something moved beneath the door. A shadow, slowly crossing from one side to the other. We ran. Neither of us said a word. We simply turned and sprinted toward the stairs. Every survival instinct in my body screamed the same thing. Get out. We nearly fell trying to reach the front door. The moment we got outside, we didn't stop. We ran all the way back to the road. Only then did we finally catch our breath. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. We just stared at the house from a distance, waiting, watching. Then we saw it. A light. Appearing inside one of the upstairs windows. A single yellow light. Slowly moving from room to room. As if someone was walking through the house holding a lantern. The house wasn't abandoned. Someone had been inside the entire time, watching us, listening to us, maybe even following us from room to room. For several weeks, I avoided that side of town completely. I didn't tell many people what happened. Most wouldn't have believed me anyway. But the house stayed in my mind. Every time I drove nearby, I found myself looking toward the property. Most days, everything looked normal, dark, silent, empty. Then one evening, nearly a month later, I saw something that brought all the fear rushing back. A vehicle was parked in the driveway. The first vehicle anyone had seen there in years. I slowed down and watched from the road. An older man stepped out. He carried several grocery bags toward the front door. Then he stopped, turned his head, and looked directly at me. Even from that distance, I could tell he wasn't surprised to see me. It felt like he already knew who I was. as if someone had described me to him. I drove away immediately, and I've never gone back. To this day, I still don't know who was behind that locked door. I don't know who wrote those notes. And I don't know why someone spent years documenting the lives of strangers from inside that house. But one thing became painfully clear. The house had never been abandoned. Someone was living there the entire time, watching, waiting, and making sure nobody stayed long enough to learn the truth.